Something else to look out for this week. Both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been called to appear in front of the public inquiry into the infected blood scandal. Now, the inquiry was set up 5 years ago under Sir Brian Langstaff to investigate how people with haemophilia and other blood disorders became infected with HIV and hepatitis through contaminated blood products during the 1970s and 80s. More than 3,000 people have since died. Their families and many others who've been affected are still waiting for full compensation. Earlier this evening, I asked the SNP MP and surgeon, Dr. Philipa Whitford, to describe the scale of the scandal.
I think it's frequently been described as the worst medical disaster in the history of the NHS. And I think it would be, frankly, hard to argue with that. I certainly first became aware of it in the kind of early to mid 80s when I was a young surgeon, and it had a profound effect on me and my approach to surgery. Just realizing that something I might have given to a patient with good intention could actually have harmed them.
So you were already practicing when this came to light. We're still talking about it. How do you feel about the length of time that this has taken to come to its conclusion?
I think it's outrageous. My entire surgical career has come and gone, and yet people affected by contaminated blood and contaminated blood products are still fighting for justice. And the fact that we got a public inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff has been very clear in his recommendations, and yet the government are still dragging their feet. I mean, this is really just heaping insult on injury.
You're vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the issue, and I imagine through that you've come into contact with many of the people who've been affected. How have they spoken to you about what they've been through?
It was just utterly harrowing and heartbreaking watching people, whether they were victims, relatives, loved ones, the bereaved, all going through this horrible, harrowing process to give evidence. And as some of it involved medical staff not telling patients that they were HIV positive or hepatitis C positive, or not being open about risks, made me actually feel really ashamed of my own profession, which is not something that I normally do. So the activists, the victims have gone through this harrowing process to try and uncover everything. And yet the government are still delaying in actually paying compensation. The loss of trust in the government is terrible. And when I've been speaking to victims of it recently, their feeling is literally that the government are just dragging their heels and waiting for them to die, because almost 600 of them have died during the inquiry.
The government's point that they make is that this is a very complex issue. I mean, they have accepted the need for compensation as a matter of principle. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I'm not really sure just how complex it really is. If you've accepted culpability for it, and obviously we have had all the evidence about both the bad decisions that were made in the 70s and 80s when information was there on the danger of products, but also then the later attempts at destruction of documents and covering things up, then the government should actually get on with it. Now, there's work to be done. There's no question about that. But we're not really actually seeing any action. You know, there's no chair appointed to set up this independent compensation body. There's no sign of it being set up. Obviously, Sir Brian Langstaff is calling members of the cabinet back in front of the committee. The problem is when the final report is delivered and the inquiry is closed, Sir Brian Langstaff loses some of his power to hold the government to account. And that's what people are afraid of, is that then it becomes something that is again kicked into the long grass, or, oh, well, the government can't afford this.
The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have both been called to the inquiry next week. What do you make of that? Is that an important moment for the inquiry and for the victims to hear from them?
Oh, I think it will be. And, I don't think that Sir Brian will be taking any prisoners in these sessions. I think he will absolutely be holding them to account. There's a real distrust building in the community of those affected by contaminated blood. These are people who've been campaigning for, 30, 40 years trying to get justice. Many of them are ill. people. Many of them, if they didn't know their HIV or hepatitis status, they have infected their partners. There's really a huge amount of suffering. And if you think back to the 80s and 90s, the stigma associated with HIV/AIDS meant that, people lost their jobs. People often had to move out of their houses. They've been struggling financially and struggling medically all of this time. And now when they saw the light at the end of the tunnel, that light just seems to keep moving back and moving back.
Do you think that something like this could happen again in the NHS? Or is it something that was very particular to that time? Have lessons been learnt that would stop this sort of a scandal erupting again?
I would certainly hope so. I mean, there's lots of different components, and it's there for many different governments, many different politicians, and many different civil servants. But I think it would be vital that we saw government take responsibility, apologise, and then actually put in process work to make sure that a scandal like this could never happen again.
That was the SNP MP, Dr. Philipa Whitford. She's on the all-party parliamentary group on this issue. Fleur, I mean, you heard what she's got to say. You've spoken, I think, recently in the debate on this in the Commons. Where do you think Parliament is on this issue? Is there a consensus that compensation needs to just get going?
I have never spoken in a debate which was as emotionally charged as that debate was. To have families there that most people in the chamber of all parties have spoken to, have constituents, and I've spoken to many of the families, those infected, those affected by this, and it's absolutely heartbreaking, the level of state failure, and then having to, despite being so ill, having to fight and fight for compensation for so long, and having got to a stage of having an inquiry, having a report, and still they haven't got the compensation they need. That justice delayed is justice denied rang around the chamber. We really need the government to move faster on this. When I think of the scale of the compensation payments paid during COVID for different ways, really done very quickly. And then the government saying that they are just, why they're taking so long to set up this body and to make those payments to bereaved parents, to bereaved children. I just don't know why it's taking so long, and that was the feeling in the chamber.
I mean, you heard Jeremy Quinn, I think, in the Commons explain that from the government's point of view, it's a complex picture to administer this. Rosie, is this an issue that has resonated with you, something that has really stood out as a scandal?
I mean, actually, I only sort of kind of recalled today that in 1983, when my brother was born, my mum had 15 pints of blood and plasma. And in 1986, she was then called to an appointment and found out she was one of the lucky ones because her plasma was from a single English donor. And so I've just spent, since I've discovered we're going to talk about this today, thinking how humbled I am. We've had those 40 years since my brother was born without all this suffering. And my heart just goes out to these people. And I agree fully that compensation needs to come soon. They've missed so much.
Danny, is this something that you've come across in your constituency at all?
Well, it's certainly an issue across the country, and I share the concern that has been expressed, and that debate was very impactful. And across the House, you hear everybody demanding speed, and the government itself recognises that. It certainly recognises the moral case for compensation and for that to be done quickly. The challenges obviously are around the complexity, the lack of data, the very wide range of potential applicants that would be involved, the need for primary legislation to execute it. How do you manage the different health authorities across the UK? So there are real challenges. There can't be any suggestion in my mind that the government is willing to delay the process here. They'll be working as hard as they can through these very difficult challenges, but I share everybody else's view that we need to be getting on with it as fast as possible. I
mean, Fleur, do you think that this is something that could happen again in the NHS?
I hope not. I think lessons have been learnt, and as Philipa said, things have been put in place in the NHS that this won't happen again. However, until the justice is seen, until the payment is given out and the compensation is there, we haven't really closed this issue at all. And we haven't said as a state there was a failure. There are some things that could be done quite quickly. A bespoke psychological service to support the victims and their families in England could be set up quite quickly. Those interim payments and the assessments of people could start being made now. There could be inroads. And that's what Sir Brian Langstaff, who chairs the inquiry inquiry is saying. And that's why he's taken the extraordinary decision to call people in at such a high level next week, because he's so frustrated that things could be done on the way. And that's why he didn't wait for a big report at the end of the inquiry. He produced 2 interim reports along the way to say, look, these are things you could be doing right now. And so by pointing a spotlight on the people at the very top of government next week, I hope we will see some change.
The final report set for the autumn, I think, but the inquiry will hear from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor next week.